It was the kind of night when the wind seemed to speak. October 12th, 1893. The rain came down in thin, relentless sheets, tapping against the tall windows of Hollowford Manor like impatient fingers. The lamps along the deserted roads swayed in the wind, their light bending and shattering across the soaked cobblestones. Inside, the grand house stood in half-darkness, its walls breathing with age, the air carrying that faint, unmistakable scent of damp wood and dust that clung to places where history had not yet let go. The Hollowford family had lived there for generations, their name tied to the manor as tightly as the ivy that crept up its outer walls. Yet tonight, the house felt unwelcoming, as though it knew its secrets were about to be pried open. At the heart of it all sat Jonathan Greaves, a local historian who had recently been commissioned by the county to catalog Hollowford's estate records. He had expected ledgers, inventories, dull paperwork, the bones of a family's financial life. But what he found instead would unravel him, piece by piece. Spread out on the heavy oak desk in the library was a collection of dusty account books. Most were predictable: farm yields, tenant rents, shipments of coal and timber. But at the very bottom of the stack lay one unlike the others. Its leather binding was cracked, its edges stiff with age, and a strange dark stain marred the lower corner, as though the book had been dipped into something that never quite washed away. The first page was inscribed in elegant script: House of Hollowford, the Ledger of Offerings, 1812 to 1834. Jonathan frowned. Offerings? Estates kept ledgers of finances, not offerings. As he flipped through the pages, his unease deepened. Instead of normal financial entries, the book was filled with strange notations. Names of local villagers were written in careful ink, followed by peculiar annotations: delivered, taken, returned empty. The handwriting varied slightly over the years, but the language remained consistent, disturbingly clinical, as though recording shipments of goods rather than people. One entry from 1821 made him pause. Thomas Wren, 14 years. Delivered on All Hallows Eve. Returned empty. Jonathan's stomach turned. He flipped ahead. Eleanor Price, 9 years. Taken on Midwinter's Night. Returned empty. The more he read, the colder the library seemed to grow. Each entry was the same: names, ages, dates, always marked with delivered, taken, or returned empty, but never a note of coin or payment. He pushed back from the desk, running a trembling hand through his hair. Surely this was some kind of twisted joke, perhaps the work of a deranged family member long ago. But then he noticed the final entry. Unlike the others, it was written in a hurried, jagged hand, the ink darker, as if pressed into the paper with violent urgency. No more names. The ledger is full. The debt will collect itself. Jonathan's breath caught. He stared at the words, the storm outside lashing harder against the windows, as though the world itself was warning him to stop. And then came the sound, a soft thud from the far end of the library. He turned quickly, his lantern throwing shadows across the shelves. The manor was supposed to be empty. The caretakers had left hours ago, and he was the only one with a key to the library. Yet as he stood, straining his ears, he swore he heard the faint scrape of leather against wood. The ledger. When he turned back, the book was no longer lying flat. Its cover had shifted just slightly, as though invisible fingers had brushed against it. The pages stirred faintly, though no draft passed through the room. Jonathan swallowed hard, his pulse racing. He should leave, lock the library, return to town, tell Mo what he had found. Yet something rooted him in place, a curiosity heavier than fear. Slowly, almost against his will, he leaned over the ledger once more. At the bottom of the final page, below the ominous last entry, new words were forming. The ink bled across the page, curling into letters as if written by an unseen hand. Jonathan Greaves. Delivered October 12th, 1893. Returned empty. The lantern in his hand flickered violently, shadows stretching like grasping arms along the walls. Jonathan stumbled back, the blood draining from his face. His name, his own name, was now etched into the ledger's cursed history. The storm roared outside, drowning out his gasping breath. The manor groaned as though alive, its old bones shifting in protest. Jonathan realized too, late, what he had uncovered. The ledger was not a record. It was a contract, and now it had claimed him. The morning after the fire, a pale gray fog hung heavy over the fields surrounding the little Missouri town. The ruins of the church still smoldered, sending faint trails of smoke into the autumn air. The townspeople gathered in silence, as though their words could not yet grasp the enormity of what had happened. 80 souls had entered the wooden church for evening service. Not one had returned. Sheriff Elias Turner stood at the edge of the blackened wreck, his boots sinking into the damp ash. He had seen fires before, barns struck by lightning, houses ruined by kerosene lamps, but never anything so sudden, so consuming. The fire had left no trace of pews, hymnals, or even bodies. The earth was charred as though the flames had risen from beneath, swallowing everything in their path. The absence of human remains was the most disturbing fact. In every other fire he had seen, bone and ash lingered. Here, nothing. Beside him, Reverend Caldwell clutched his Bible with shaking hands, whispering scripture as though the words might offer explanation. His congregation was gone, his church reduced to cinders, and yet his eyes darted not toward heaven, but toward the ground, as though he suspected something buried there. Among the crowd, a lone figure stood apart. Margaret Hensley, the elderly woman who lived in the weather-beaten farmhouse just beyond the churchyard. Her wrinkled face was unreadable, her shawl pulled tightly around her shoulders. She had been the one to ring the alarm, crying out that the church was aflame. Some whispered she had been awake, sitting on her porch, staring at the building before the fire ever began. The sheriff approached her cautiously. "You saw it first, Mrs. Hensley?" he asked. Her cloudy eyes met his, and for a long moment she did not answer. Then she nodded. "I saw the glow inside before there was smoke, like lantern light, but red to red, and I heard singing." "From inside the church?" the sheriff pressed. She gripped her shawl tighter. "Yes, a hymn, but not one I knew. It wasn't English. It wasn't anything I'd heard before. The voices were not theirs, not my neighbors, not God's." Her words spread through the gathered crowd like a draft of cold wind. A farmer spat on the ground and muttered about blasphemy. Another crossed himself quickly. The sheriff, uneasy but determined, ordered a search of the ruins. Men sifted through the ash with shovels, women praying silently as they watched. Hours passed, yet no human trace was uncovered. Not a fragment of bone, not a button, not a shoe buckle. The earth beneath the floorboards was strangely dry, as if the fire had seared deeper into the soil itself. By late afternoon, the fog had thickened, and the smoke that lingered over the ruins seemed to coil into unnatural shapes. Some swore they saw faces in it, faces of the lost congregation, mouths open as if still singing. One young boy collapsed in fright, claiming he heard voices whispering his name from the ash. Reverend Caldwell fell to his knees in despair. "It is judgment," he cried. "The Lord has taken them up and left us behind." But Margaret Hensley shook her head slowly. "No," she whispered. "They weren't taken up. They were taken down." The sheriff tried to silence her words, but they had already rooted in the minds of the townsfolk. Fear took shape, growing stronger with each passing hour. The missing congregation had not died in the fire. They had vanished into something older, something darker than flame. That night, Sheriff Turner returned alone to the ruins. Lantern in hand, he stepped carefully over the charred remains of the foundation. The silence pressed heavy against his ears, and then he heard it, faint, distant, rising from beneath the earth. A hymn, in a language no man should know. The charred skeleton of St. Augustine's Church stood like the blackened ribcage of some great beast. Its roof collapsed inward, leaving only jagged beams pointing to the sky like accusatory fingers. The October wind carried the acrid tang of burnt timber, though the fire had been extinguished months ago. Even now, as the townsfolk rebuilt their lives around the scarred lot, a sense of unfinished mourning clung to the place. Detective Nathaniel Harlow returned that evening, lantern in hand, boots crunching on the loose gravel scattered by workers who had begun clearing debris. The daylight had revealed nothing new to him earlier. Only ash, fragments of pews, and broken glass melted into grotesque shapes. But at night, he believed, truths often whispered where daylight refused. The townspeople avoided the ruins after dusk. They muttered of strange noises, chanting, bells tolling without ropes, shadows gathering where no flame burned. But Nathaniel had heard rumors like these before, often born from grief. Yet, as he crossed the churchyard gate, a subtle shift in the air told him this was different. The lantern flame shivered, its glow stretching the shadows unnaturally long. Nathaniel set his jaw. "I've seen darker things in wars than ash and rumor," he muttered, as though to steady himself. He stepped inside. The floor was gone in places, replaced with gaping cavities where the foundation stones had cracked. He climbed over beams, his boots leaving prints in the thick dust. Every creak echoed, magnified by the hollow skeleton of the church. And then faintly he heard it, a whisper, not the rustle of wind through splinters, nor the settling of ruined timber. It was a voice, low and strained, threading through the silence like smoke. "Confess." Nathaniel froze. He raised his lantern, but its light revealed only the same skeletal beams. His heart thudded hard against his ribs, but he swallowed it down. "Who's there?" The whisper did not answer in words this time, but in a sound like pages turning, crisp and deliberate. He followed it, weaving between the ruins, until he reached what remained of the altar. The cross that had once hung above it was nothing but a warped outline burned into the wall. In its place, a blackened wooden box sat half buried in soot. Nathaniel crouched, brushing away the ash. It was a confessional booth, or rather what had survived one. Its door hung ajar, its frame warped by flame, but the inside was oddly intact, as though spared by selective fire. The smell hit him first, not ash, but something metallic coppery. His hand went to the lantern, holding it closer. Inside, the charred walls bore faint markings, not mere scorch patterns, symbols carved deep into the wood, then blackened by fire. Their edges glowed faintly red, as though the fire had never entirely died. They curled like Latin letters, but twisted wrong, spiraling into each other like worms. Nathaniel felt his stomach tighten. The whisper returned, clearer now, directly in his ear, though no one stood near. "Forgive me, Father, for I have—" The voice broke, dissolving into a moan. Nathaniel stumbled back, breath shallow. He had heard dying men cry for absolution on the battlefield. But this was different. This was not memory, it was present, alive. He gathered himself. If he fled now, the truth would remain buried with the ash. He reached into the booth, his fingers brushing against the wood. It was warm, too warm. He pulled back quickly, and then he saw it. Beneath the booth, half hidden in the soot, was a book, the ledger. He pulled it free, coughing as a cloud of ash rose. The leather cover was cracked and blackened, but intact. Across its surface, scorched letters spelled something faint, manifestum. He opened it carefully. The pages, though singed at the edges, were legible. Each bore neat handwriting, dated, listing names, parishioners of the church, families, children, old men. But as he flipped forward, something shifted. The dates blurred. The names grew strange. Some were scratched out violently, ink smeared as though by shaking hand. Others were not names at all, but descriptions. The woman with the veil, the child with the hollow eyes. And then he turned to a page that made his breath catch. It bore the date of the fire, and there written in red, not ink, but something thicker, darker, were 12 names, each marked with a cross. Nathaniel whispered them aloud. They were not the names of the missing worshippers he'd memorized. They were different, older, foreign. Some were unpronounceable. The whisper rose again, this time not one voice, but many, overlapping, choking the air. They are not gone. Nathaniel slammed the ledger shut, clutching it against his chest. The lantern flickered violently, the flame shrinking as though starved of oxygen. A sudden gust swept through the ruins, rattling the beams above. He turned sharply. At the far end of the church, beyond the broken nave, stood a figure, still, watching. The lantern's light only reached far enough to show its outline. Tall, draped in what looked like a charred robe, its head tilted unnaturally to the side. Nathaniel raised his lantern higher, but the flame sputtered, shrinking until only a dull glow remained. He blinked, and the figure was gone. His breath came fast now. He forced himself to turn back to the ledger, to anchor himself in the tangible. He slid it into his coat. Whatever this was, it was evidence, something the townsfolk could not dismiss as smoke-borne delusion. But as he moved to leave, he noticed something else. The floor before the altar was cracked open. Black stone split like brittle parchment. From the crevice, a faint red glow pulsed, slow, rhythmic, almost like a heartbeat. Nathaniel leaned forward, the glow painting his face in crimson. And from that fissure rose not smoke, but something stranger, a whispering draft, carrying faint words that curled and sank into his ears. Not burned, only waiting. He staggered back, nearly losing his footing. The ledger pressed against his chest like a weight, heavier than its size should allow. The lantern gave one final sputter before extinguishing, leaving him in suffocating darkness. And in that darkness, the whispers swelled. Dozens of voices murmuring, pleading, condemning. Nathaniel's instinct screamed to run. He stumbled through the ruins, hands clawing at the black air until he burst out into the moonlight of the churchyard. The night was still. Crickets chirped. The town lay silent in the distance. But the voices did not leave him. They lingered faintly, curling at the edges of his hearing. And in his coat, the ledger pulsed with warmth, as though alive. Nathaniel straightened himself, chest heaving, and looked back at the ruin. The fire had not ended anything. It had only opened something, something that still whispered. The church loomed taller than ever that evening, its broken spire cutting into the crimson sky as though it still tried to reach heaven, despite the sins buried beneath it. Jonathan approached with his notebook clutched tightly in hand, his knuckles pale as bone. The villagers had given him wary looks when they saw him walking toward the ruins again. They whispered words like cursed, unforgiven, and marked. He ignored them, though their voices lingered in his head like gnats that would not die. Inside, the air was heavier than before. Dust hung in shafts of dying sunlight, turning the space into something ethereal, almost otherworldly. The pews stood, as before, crooked and half-burned. But something felt different. There was a tension, an invisible thread pulled taut across the sanctuary, as though the walls themselves strained to keep secrets buried. Jonathan lowered himself onto the first row of pews, his hands trembling as he flipped open the journal. He wanted to gather his thoughts, to put reason where fear threatened to take root. But as his pen touched paper, a sound cut through the silence, a whisper. At first, he thought it was the wind. Yet the church had no windows, no cracks large enough to carry such a sound. The voice came from beneath him, seeping up through the stone floor like moisture. Jonathan froze, pen hovering above the paper, his ears strained. "Why did you come back?" His breath caught in his throat. The voice was faint, genderless, rasping like the last air from dying lungs. He looked around, but the church was empty. The whisper came again, rising through the pews like the voice of the dead carried on soil. "They never left, we never left." Jonathan stumbled backward, his notebook slipping from his hands and falling against the cracked floor. For a moment, he thought he saw it, the stone beneath the pulpit shifting, not physically moving, but trembling, as though something beneath pressed against it, yearning to break through. Compelled by terror or perhaps the pull of truth, he approached the pulpit. Its charred wood was brittle under his hands. He crouched low, placing his palm against the stone tiles. They were unnaturally cold, as if death itself clung to them. Then came the visions. His mind flooded, not with dreams, not with imagination, but with memories not his own. The church alight in furious flames. Dozens of worshippers screaming, pounding against locked doors. The priest, his face shadowed, chanting words Jonathan could not understand, as though feeding the fire instead of fighting it. And in those flames, figures, not human, shapes twisting, laughing, clawing at the parishioners, dragging them into a darkness that stretched far deeper than the fire. Jonathan tore his hand away and fell back, gasping for breath. His eyes darted wildly across the ruined church, but the vision still burned behind his lids. His heartbeat thundered, each thump echoing louder in the hollow space. He grabbed his notebook and scribbled furiously, his writing almost illegible. The fire was no accident. They were trapped. Something was summoned. His pen snapped mid-sentence, ink bleeding across the page like spreading rot. Before he could process further, he heard another sound. Not a whisper this time, a chant, low, guttural, vibrating through the ground. His head jerked up and his eyes widened. Shadows gathered in the far corners of the church, stretching unnaturally against the walls. They flickered and pulsed as though alive. And then he saw them. Figures, 12 of them, cloaked in ash and shadow, their forms wavering like smoke. Their faces were obscured, but their eyes glowed faintly, like embers refusing to die. They stood in silence, aligned in the same pews where the congregation once sat. Watching him, Jonathan's mouth went dry. His instincts screamed to run, but his body betrayed him, frozen in place. The air thickened, pressing against his chest. One figure stepped forward. Its face flickered between flesh and bone, between life and charred remains. Its voice was a rasp that dragged against the silence like a dull knife. You wrote their names. Jonathan's hands trembled violently, clutching the notebook. What do you want from me? The figure tilted its head, the faintest curl of a smile. Or was it a grimace? Not what we want. What he wants. The others spoke in unison then, their voices overlapping in a chorus that made Jonathan's ears bleed. The priest called us. He locked the doors. He gave us their souls. Jonathan stumbled back, his heel catching on broken stone. No, it was a fire, an accident. The lead figure extended a withered hand, finger pointing toward the pulpit. The ground beneath it cracked faintly, a thin line spreading across the stone like a wound opening. Accidents do not whisper for centuries. The crack widened, and from within it rose the faint smell of burned flesh, mixed with something older, something fouler. Jonathan gagged, covering his mouth, his knees trembling. He forced himself to back away, step by shaky step. The shadows did not follow. They only watched, silent now. Their eyes burned like cinders in the dark. Jonathan stumbled out of the church, bursting into the cold air of the night. His lungs ached as he gasped, his legs nearly buckling beneath him. Behind him, the church stood silent once more, its broken spire cutting the moonlight. But he knew he hadn't imagined it. He knew now. Something had been called that night. Something had been fed. And the stone beneath that pulpit was not holding the dead. It was holding the hungry. The fire had consumed more than wood and stone. It had devoured certainty itself. By dawn, the ruins of St. Matthew's Church stood like a charred skeleton against the horizon, its blackened beams rising like twisted arms pleading toward a silent sky. The people of Ashford gathered at the smoldering site, their voices hushed, their faces pale from fear more than grief. Father Alden walked among them, robes singed, his once steady hands trembling as he sifted through the rubble. The silence was heavier than the smoke, for no bodies had yet been found. Not a single bone, not a scrap of flesh. 80 souls had entered the church that night. Not one had been accounted for. At first, the townsfolk muttered explanations. The fire had been too hot. The bodies had been reduced to ash. But Father Alden knew better. He had seen fires before, barns, homes, even whole fields gone aflame. Wood and stone might crumble, yet flesh always left remnants. The curve of a rib, the socket of an eye, the brittle fragments of hands raised in prayer. But here, among the blackened pews and cracked altar, there was nothing. The wind shifted, carrying with it the acrid stench of smoke. Alden paused near the altar stone. Its surface cracked clean down the middle, as though struck by a divine hand. His eyes narrowed. Something gleamed faintly within the fissure, too deliberate, too unnatural. He bent low and brushed aside ash with his sleeve. There, hidden beneath the broken stone, lay a dark iron key, its surface etched with symbols he did not recognize. The townsfolk pressed close when they saw it, whispering among themselves. A key, one man muttered. But to what? A woman clutched her shawl tighter. Perhaps the fire was no accident. Father Alden said nothing, though his thoughts churned. He closed his fist around the key and slid it into his pocket. It was colder than ice, even after lying in the heart of the flames. By afternoon, the town council convened in the blackened square. Merchants, farmers, and elders stood shoulder to shoulder, their voices rising in heated debate. Some called for an investigation, others for prayer, still more for silence. Superstition clung to Ashford like ivy to old stone. Too many whispered of curses, of sins brought down upon the faithful. "We must tell the bishop," one councilman declared. "Invite the world to mock us," another snapped. "Do you want Ashford known as a place where 80 souls vanished into smoke?" "Vanished," a farmer barked. "No, they were taken. This was no fire, it was a hand from hell." The murmurs swelled until they became a tide. Only Father Alden's voice cut through. "Enough," he said, his tone sharper than it had ever been from a pulpit. The crowd stilled. "This is no time for blame or hysteria. We must seek truth." "And where shall we find that, Father?" asked a thin woman near the back. "In the ashes? In the silence of the dead?" Father Alden hesitated. His hand brushed the hidden key in his pocket. Perhaps beneath both. That night, he returned alone to the ruins. The moon hung low, veiled by drifting clouds. The burned timbers creaked as though the church itself still groaned in agony. Alden moved slowly, his lantern casting long shadows against the blackened stone. He approached the altar once more, where the crack split like an open wound. Kneeling, he pressed the iron key into the fissure. To his astonishment, the stone shifted, grinding against itself as though awakened from centuries of sleep. Dust cascaded down, and a hidden panel slid aside, revealing a narrow stairwell descending into the earth. The lantern flame flickered, as though hesitant. Alden swallowed hard, whispering a prayer more out of habit than conviction. He stepped into the stairwell, the stone cold beneath his boots. The air grew damp, heavy with the scent of mold and something older, something that reeked faintly of iron and rot. At the bottom lay a small crypt. The walls were lined with niches, some filled with bones so ancient they crumbled at his touch. Yet at the center stood a stone pedestal, and upon it rested a leather-bound book, its cover blackened but not burned, as if the flames above had spared it deliberately. With trembling hands, Alden opened the book. The script inside was jagged, written in Latin that twisted and warped, words that should have been holy but read like blasphemy. His eyes traced the passages, and with each line his heart sank further. It spoke not of salvation, but of sacrifice, not of Christ, but of something far older, something that demanded worship through fire. The names of villages long forgotten were listed, each followed by the same words. No bodies remained. Ashford was but the latest entry. Father Alden staggered back, bile rising in his throat. His lantern trembled in his grip, casting wild shadows that seemed to dance along the walls. Suddenly, a sound broke the silence, the faintest whisper, curling around him like smoke. He froze. The whisper grew clearer, not in Latin, but in English, though the voice was neither male nor female. "The offering is made. The debt is paid. 80 souls carried in flame. Will you join them, shepherd?" Alden's knees weakened. He dropped the book, its pages fluttering open to a passage marked with a symbol identical to the one etched on the iron key. His breath came fast, his heart pounding. "I serve God," he stammered. The whisper chuckled, low and endless. "And yet you stand where he does not. The fire has chosen. The ash has spoken." The lantern guttered, nearly extinguishing. Alden lurched up the stairs, his cassock catching on a jagged stone. He tore free, stumbling into the ruin above, gasping for air. The night sky seemed darker, the stars smothered as though hidden by invisible hands. He collapsed at the altar, clutching the key as though it were a crucifix. His faith, once unshakable, now trembled like the flame within his lantern. He knew what he had read, what he had heard, but how could he tell town? How could he admit that their loved ones had not perished, but been taken? The following morning, a small group of townsfolk returned to the ruins. They found Father Alden seated on the altar steps, his face pale, his eyes hollow. When asked what he had discovered, he offered only vague words. The fire was not natural, he said. It was an old curse, one written in the stones themselves. The people recoiled, muttering prayers. Some demanded to see proof, but Alden refused. He could not show them the book, not without unraveling what little sanity remained. Yet whispers spread faster than truth. Soon, all of Ashford spoke of hidden crypts and devil's bargains. Mothers clutched their children tighter. Men carried torches to bed, as if light could shield them from whatever had claimed their kin. And still, each night, Father Alden heard the voice. It came in the silence between breaths, in the creak of his wooden floorboards, in the rustle of the wind. Always the same refrain. The offering is made. The debt is paid. On the seventh night after the fire, Alden dreamed. Or perhaps it was no dream at all. He stood once more in the crypt, the book open before him. The names of Ashford's missing parishioners glowed faintly upon the page, their letters shimmering like embers. Slowly, the ink bled, reforming into a single new line. Father Alden. He awoke with a cry, sweat drenching his body. The iron key lay upon his chest, though he had locked it away in his desk. His hands shook so violently he could not hold his rosary. It was then he knew. The fire was not finished. The 80 souls were not enough. Something beneath Ashford hungered still. The days after the first incident blurred into a rhythm of dread, a routine sculpted not by life, but by the unnatural. In the Matson house, every shadow seemed alive, every silence too loud. The family moved through their rooms like guests unwelcome in their own home, speaking in hushed tones, glancing nervously at corners that should have been harmless. But night was the true enemy. It always began the same way. At first, just after midnight, a faint whispering would rise through the halls. It wasn't the kind of whisper one might mistake for the wind pressing against window panes. No, it was a chorus, deliberate, threading together words that sounded like scripture but broken, as though read backward or torn apart. Mary, pale and sleepless, confessed to her husband that she could make out fragments. The Lord is broken, the Lamb is devoured, the table is overturned. Each phrase left her trembling, as though she had sinned simply by hearing them. Thomas, desperate to protect his wife and children, tried ignoring it at first. But when their youngest Samuel awoke screaming with welts across his chest that burned in the shape of crooked crosses, denial became impossible. "It's marking him," Mary whispered one morning, cradling Samuel as he shook violently in her arms. "It's claiming him." The boy clung to her with wide eyes, his lips cracked and bleeding, as if he had been biting them raw in his sleep. He muttered only one phrase again and again, "She sings to me." Meanwhile, miles away, in the dim municipal records building, Jonathan Keene spread out brittle documents across a wooden table. His eyes burned from hours of searching, but his hands refused to stop. He had gone deeper than parish ledgers now, further than baptismal rolls or cemetery records. He was searching through incidents, buried reports few had ever read, and then he found it, an article, folded carefully within an 1843 file, yellowed with age, headlines scrawled in uneven ink. Unholy gathering in Hollowford. 12 reported missing after moonless Massachusetts. His pulse thudded. The article described a gathering at the outskirts of the very woods the Madsens now bordered. Villagers whispered that those missing had not been taken by wolves, nor had they fled debt or disease. They had been offered. There was talk of chanting, of crude wooden dolls left dangling from trees, of firelight dancing against the trunks. The word sacrificial psalms repeated 3 times in the article. King leaned back in his chair, his throat tight. The date of this event was the exact month recorded in one of the strange marginal notes he'd seen in Father Madsen's old sermons. The family's patriarch had not been merely a minister. He had been a witness, perhaps even keeper, of something blacker than any Christian rite. Back in the farmhouse, Mary had begun a ritual of her own. She lined the children's rooms with salt, tracing a barrier across their thresholds. Each night, she recited Psalm 23 aloud, though her voice broke with each repetition. But the house fought back. On the 3rd night of her prayers, the Bible in her hands split at the binding. Its pages fell loose and fluttered to the floor as though struck by a great, invisible hand. The salt lines shifted, pushed aside as though something had crawled through them. And then the singing began again. This time, the voices were not distant. They filled the halls. Low, guttural tones harmonized with a higher, keening wail. Samuel rose from his bed, eyes rolled white, walking toward the stairs as though summoned. Mary grabbed him, shaking him violently until he screamed. The other children cried in terror, clutching their mother's skirts. Thomas stood frozen in the doorway, unable to move. He swore he saw a shape behind his wife, a figure like a woman with her face veiled in black, standing so near Mary that her breath should have stirred her hair. But Mary noticed nothing when Thomas shouted. The figure dissolved into shadow, but Samuel's cries turned into laughter. Jonathan Keene's next visit took him to the oldest resident of Hollowford, a woman named Mrs. Halewood, whose family had lived near the woods since before the Civil War. She was almost blind, her skin like parchment, but her memory sharper than any book. "I know what you've been reading," she rasped as he entered her crumbling cottage. "The 12 that vanished. You think it ended then?" "It didn't." Keene leaned forward. "What happened to them?" Her milky eyes stared somewhere far beyond him. "Their names were struck from record. The church ordered it, but the families whispered of a pact. Those taken weren't gone. They were given to her." "Her?" Keene pressed. "The woman in the Psalms. Not Scripture's Psalms, hers. Broken words sung at night. She promised bounty, protection from famine. But always she asked for more. They thought it ended when the last child was taken. But," her hand trembled as she pointed toward the woods, "she always comes back." Keene's blood ran cold. "And the Madsens? They built their house where the fire once burned," she croaked. "On her altar." That same night, Thomas Madsen tried to reclaim his home. He gathered his family in the parlor and declared aloud that they would not be driven out. He struck a match and lit every candle, flooding the room with light. "We are God's children," he proclaimed, gripping the family Bible. "This house will not bow to shadows." The children huddled together, eyes wide. Mary sat rigid, her lips moving soundlessly as she mouthed silent prayers. And for a moment, there was stillness. But then the air shifted. The flames of every candle bent sideways, as though pushed by an invisible wind. The Bible in Thomas's hand grew hot, searing his palm until he dropped it with a hiss of pain. It fell open on the rug, not to Scripture, but to pages scrawled with unfamiliar ink. The words spiraled, broken verses crawling across the paper like insects. "The lamb is devoured. The shepherd bleeds. The psalms are sung anew." Mary screamed. The children wailed. And then in the silence that followed, Samuel spoke in a voice not his own. "She is at the door." At that same hour, Keene was bent over another discovery. Among the ledgers of the old church, hidden beneath pasted-over pages, he found Father Madsen's confession. It was brief, hurried, but damning. "We sang to keep her at bay. We offered to keep our children safe. But the Psalms no longer protect us. They break. They twist. and she demands not just strangers, but blood of our own. Keen sat frozen. He realized the horrifying truth. Father Matson himself had been part of the pact, and the family now living in that house, his bloodline, was paying the price generations later. Back at the farmhouse, the night ended in terror. Thomas, wounded and burned from the Bible's betrayal, gathered his family and forced them upstairs, barricading the bedroom door. The children clung together on the bed, Mary whispering frantic prayers, while Thomas held a poker in his hand, his knuckles white. For hours they listened. The whispers never ceased. Sometimes they came from the hallway, sometimes from within the very walls. Once Samuel opened his mouth, and the voices poured out of him like a chorus of the damned. And then, just before dawn, silence. But silence was worse, for etched across the outside of their door, scratched deep into the wood by something with claws, was a single word: return. In town, Jonathan Keene folded the confession back into its file, his hands shaking. He knew he had little time. If the Psalms were being sung again, if the pact was reviving itself through the family, then the haunting was not a random curse. It was a debt, and debts, once called upon, demanded payment in full. The air in Shanner's court had changed. Where once it carried the murmurs of merchants and the light steps of servants, now it bore a weight that pressed on every chest, an unseen force that made even seasoned guards glance over their shoulders. The villagers, drawn daily by curiosity or fear, had begun to stand at a distance, whispering among themselves about what lurked in the depths of the king's new hall. They said the stones breathed at night. They said the ashes from the old fire pit shifted on their own. And some swore that in the silence before dawn, a voice not quite human, not quite beast, could be heard whispering beneath the earth. King Shanner, though outwardly unmoved, felt it most of all. He no longer slept easily. The golden crown he had once worn with pride now seemed heavier with each passing night, as though the cursed stone beneath his hall weighed upon his very head. He had ordered his men to scatter the ashes of the sacrificial fire, hoping to rid the place of its gloom. But when dawn came, the ash had always returned, gathered in the center of the chamber, forming a shape no man dared describe aloud. His queen Lala, who once spoke freely, now walked silently in the halls, her eyes hollow, as though she had glimpsed something that had stolen her voice. Shanner asked her once what troubled her, but she only placed her hand on his chest and whispered, "Do not go down there again." But Shanner could not obey. Each night, when the court had stilled and only the torches remained, he found himself drawn to the ashes. He would sit alone in the great chamber, watching the faint smoke curl from the pit that was supposed to be long dead. And sometimes he swore he could hear his own name rising with that smoke. It was on such a night that he first saw it, lines in the ash, delicate as though drawn by an unseen hand. At first he thought it the wind, until the lines deepened and curved into symbols no mortal tongue could read. They burned faintly red in the torchlight, pulsing as though alive. He tried to erase them with his foot, but the ash clung to his skin, staining it like blood. When he wiped it away, the marks returned sharper, demanding. The next morning, the priests arrived, not by his summons, by their own will. They claimed they had been visited in dreams. Each had seen the same vision, a great mouth beneath the earth, opening wider with every chant spoken in the king's hall. The more sacrifices offered, the greater its hunger grew. One priest, an old man named Darvish, warned Shanner with trembling voice, "You believe, you command it, but majesty, it is not a beast to be tamed. It is a wound. You are feeding the wound itself, and soon it will bleed us all." Shanner dismissed him at first, angered by the tremor in his tone. But Darvish's words clung to his mind long after the priest had been dragged out. For deep within him, Shanner knew. The whispers were no longer obeying him. They were guiding him. That evening, he gathered his most loyal captains. "We must descend into the earth," he declared. "If there is a mouth, then let us seal it. If there is a wound, then let us bind it. I will not be king over shadows and ash." The men followed reluctantly, torches in hand, into the stone passages beneath the hall. These tunnels, built in haste by Shanner's own order, seemed older than their making. The walls were slick, the stones damp, and faint carvings emerged beneath the grime. Figures with hollow eyes, arms raised as though in endless supplication. The deeper they went, the more the air thickened. One by one, the torches dimmed, until only a faint red glow seemed to guide them. Glow from cracks in the very earth. And there it was, the pit, not the fire pit above, but something far deeper. A chasm split through the stone, its edges crumbling, its depths hidden in an endless red haze. From within rose a sound that was not sound at all, but vibration, like the hum of countless voices speaking as one. The captains faltered. Some dropped their torches and fled back up the passage. Only 3 remained by Shanner's side, though none dared look into the abyss. But Shanner did, and what he saw turned the marrow of his bones cold. It was not a mouth of flesh nor stone, but something in between, a shifting surface that rippled like water, yet opened like lips, vast and trembling. Within it, shadows twisted, shapes of men, women, children, all reaching upward with arms outstretched, their mouths frozen in screams that made no sound. The whispers swelled. More, bring more, feed and be remembered. Shanner stumbled back, but the ash from the chasm clung to his boots, glowing faintly red. The pit did not simply hunger, it claimed. His captains pulled him away, their faces pale with terror. None spoke as they ascended, but when they reached the hall again, one dared to ask, "Majesty, what is it?" Shanner, his voice hoarse, answered, "It is not for us to name." That night, the queen found him trembling, his hands still blackened with ash. He told her nothing, but she looked into his eyes and knew enough. She wept silently beside him, whispering prayers to gods who had long since turned their gaze away. From that day on, the sacrifices grew more frequent. Shanner no longer ordered them to appease the voices. He ordered them because he feared what would happen if he did not. The pit demanded, and though he told himself he was still king, he knew in his heart he had become servant. The people began to murmur. They spoke of endless disappearances, servants, beggars, even a noble's child. They spoke of nights when the earth shook faintly beneath their feet, as though something stirred beneath their homes. Some whispered of leaving the city altogether, but those who tried were said to vanish on the roads, their tracks ending in pools of black ash. The priests, once loyal to Shanner, divided among themselves. Some said he was chosen, the vessel through which the gods would cleanse a land. Others said he had doomed them all, and Darvish, the old priest, returned one last time, slipping through the guards to kneel before the king. "End it," he begged. "Seal the pit. Tear down the hall, salt the earth, and flee if you must. But do not listen any longer." Shanner raised his hand to silence him, but before he could speak, the ash stirred. Right there in the hall before them, the pit's whispers rose, curling around their ears, their lungs, their very thoughts. Darvish clutched his chest and collapsed, his eyes wide open in death, though his lips still moved faintly, whispering words no man understood. The court fell silent. No one moved to touch the body. Shanner looked at his queen, her face pale with horror, and realized that the choice was gone. The pit had spoken. The ashes had claimed another life, and through it, they had delivered a warning. There would be no escape. The morning after the trial, Hollowford was shrouded in a silence more suffocating than any storm. It was the kind of quiet that clung to skin and seeped into bone, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. No birdsong dared stir the air. No laughter drifted from the lanes. The villagers moved cautiously, whispering only when necessary, their eyes shifting toward Hollowford Manor, as though it were wound that would not close. The manor had grown darker in reputation with every passing day. Once a proud estate, it now seemed cloaked in invisible shadow. Its windows, blackened and hollow, stared down at the town like unblinking eyes. Children, who once played daring games near its gates, now refused to pass within sight of the grounds. Even livestock balked at grazing near the stone walls that ringed its land. Something was festering there, something that no decree of law or priestly blessing could purge. Inside the manor, the remnants of the Harrington family clung to a brittle routine. Every creak of the old wooden floors seemed to echo too loudly. Every draught carried, with it, the faint stench of blood that lingered no matter how much the servants scrubbed. The trial had not ended the whispers. It had only sharpened them. The name Harrington no longer stood for nobility or wealth. It was a curse muttered beneath breaths, carried like ash on the wind. It was Mrs. Harrington who first noticed the stains. They had thought the servants' scrubbing would clear away the last traces of the terrible night. The broken glass, the spattered crimson on the banquet table, the dragged streaks across the marble floor. But beneath the morning sun, when its light struck, just so, faint lines reappeared. They were not red anymore, not precisely. Instead, they glistened a sickly brown, seeping up from the stone as though the house itself had swallowed the blood and now refused to let it go. "Again," she whispered, her hands trembling as she touched the grooves with her handkerchief. When she drew it back, the fabric bore a rust-colored smear. The servants worked harder, scrubbing with lime and boiling water until their hands blistered. But the stains returned each dawn, as if night itself restored them. Soon, the marble halls bore a patchwork of watermarks and fresh scratches where brushes and knives had tried and failed to cleanse the surface. Guests, when they came, noticed, and when they noticed, they whispered. It was not long before the manor gained a new title among villagers: the house that bled. Strange things began to happen beyond the stains. Servants claimed to hear voices in the banquet hall at night, whispers threading through the rafters though the chamber was empty. Some reported the soft clinking of glasses, the scrape of knives on porcelain, as though the terrible feast replayed itself each midnight. One girl swore she saw a pale hand glide across the table, fingertips brushing the wine goblet that had once spilled over with red. She fainted before she could scream. The Harrington children, innocent though they were, grew pale and restless. They dreamed of screaming faces, of hollow eyes watching them from the corners of their rooms. The youngest, barely 6 years old, asked her mother why the men without mouths stood in the hallway at night. Her words were dismissed as childish nonsense, but Mrs. Harrington's face blanched when she realized her daughter's description matched that of the villagers' dead. Faces distorted, mouths torn or sealed in horror. By autumn, Hollowford was consumed by unease. The church bell tolled for the dying more often than ever before. Fever spread, and livestock perished inexplicably. Some swore that the land itself had soured under the Harrington curse. The manor's fields yielded less with each harvest, though the soil had once been the richest in the county. It was Father Whitlock, the parish priest, who finally spoke aloud what others only dared whisper. He declared that the stains were not of this earth, that they were a mark of sin so grave it had seeped beyond flesh and into stone. When blood cries out, he said during a sermon, it is not to be silenced by water or lime. It demands reckoning. It demands remembrance. His words struck the congregation like hammer blows, and though no one said it outright, all eyes eventually drifted toward the manor gates. Yet for all the fear, none dared act. The Harrington name still carried enough weight that few would openly challenge them. They were both feared and despised, and in that contradiction they lingered like a ghost too stubborn to fade. Then came the night of the storm. It began with a low rumble in the distance, thunder rolling over Hollowford's fields like a drumbeat. By nightfall, rain lashed the town with such fury that shutters banged loose and roofs groaned under the onslaught. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the manor in harsh, jagged flashes. Within the great hall, the Harrington family gathered. Candles flickered wildly, shadows leaping across the stained walls. The servants huddled in corners, whispering prayers under their breath. Every crack of thunder seemed to rattle the bones of the house itself. And then the stains began to spread. It started with a single line across the floor, thin and dark, appearing where none had been moments before. Then another, and another. The marble seemed to weep from within, rivulets of blood unfurling in unnatural patterns, tracing paths across the floor as though sketching the memory of that long-ago slaughter. The children screamed. Servants fled, the hall filled with the metallic stench of iron. Mrs. Harrington clutched her children to her breast, sobbing prayers. Mr. Harrington, pale and defiant, shouted for calm, his voice swallowed by the roaring storm outside. But calm would not come. The blood did not merely stain the stone. It pooled. It thickened. Soon spread across the floor in a shallow tide, reflecting the candlelight with a sickly gleam. No matter how the servants tried to mop it, the liquid only multiplied, rising like a tide from the heart of the house. The priest was summoned. Father Whitlock arrived drenched, his Bible clutched to his chest. When he stepped into the hall and saw the crimson spreading beneath his feet, he fell to his knees. "This house," he cried, "is marked, and until its sins are confessed, it will bleed until the end of time." But confession never came. The Harringtons, proud and stubborn, refused to admit guilt. They dismissed the priest's warnings as superstition, even as a flood of blood reached the base of the walls. By dawn, the storm had passed. The rains eased and the wind grew still. But inside the manor, the stains remained thicker than ever. The servants fled that day and did not return. From that night forward, the Harrington family lived in near isolation. No visitors came willingly. Merchants refused to deliver goods past the gates. The children grew thin and wan, their eyes ringed with shadows, as though sleep no longer granted them rest. The town of Hollowford began to fracture under the weight of its curse. Some insisted the family must be driven out, that the house should be burned to purify the land. Others, fearing divine wrath, argued that to destroy the manor would unleash whatever spirit lingered within. So the villagers compromised by doing nothing, leaving the house to rot as the stains deepened. And yet, at night, they swore the air carried the faintest echo of screams. The Harrington name was no longer just cursed, it was damned. And though the family still clung to their crumbling estate, it became clear to all that Hollowford would never heal while the house that bled remained standing. The morning after Reverend Callahan's violent outburst did not feel like a morning at all. It felt like a twilight that stretched endlessly, a dim and gray pall hanging over Hollowford. The villagers moved with slow, deliberate steps, as if every action carried the weight of unseen chains. The bells of St. Bridget's no longer rang, but their absence was louder than any toll. The silence that replaced them seemed alive, crawling across the cobblestones and winding its way into the very bones of the townsfolk. For years, Hollowford had depended on the tolling of the church bells to structure their days, when to wake, when to pray, when to close their shops and gather by candlelight. Now, without them, time became unmoored. Hours bled into one another. Some swore the sun lingered too long at the horizon, unwilling to rise or set, trapping them in a perpetual dusk. Others whispered that the night stretched longer than before, that the moon lingered above like a sentinel refusing to depart. Evelyn Harding, once filled with scholarly curiosity, found herself shivering beneath her shawl as she walked the streets. She carried her notebook still, though fewer words filled its pages. What was there left to study when the village itself seemed to be unraveling? Her once precise handwriting had become shaky, smudged with ink blots as though her very mind trembled. Each night she would attempt to record the day's occurrences, only to find that hours were missing from her memory. The last thing she would recall was a sound of faint humming, a hymn sung by no one she could name, before blackness swept over her thoughts. The children of Hollowford no longer played in the streets. They stood at doorways, pale faces pressed against the glass, eyes too solemn for their age. A few mothers whispered that their children had begun speaking in voices not their own, reciting lines of scripture they had never been taught, or humming dirges too old for their young tongues. At first, these incidents were dismissed as imagination. But when 3 children simultaneously uttered the same prayer in Latin, a prayer none of their families knew, even the most skeptical grew afraid. Sheriff Olcott tried to maintain order, though his voice had grown hoarse from shouting into silence. His once strong posture now slumped beneath invisible burdens. "It's just hysteria," he declared to those who would listen. "We've let superstition dig its claws too deep." Yet even he could not explain why his own lanterns extinguished themselves at precisely the same hour each night, no matter how much oil he poured or how firmly he struck the flint. Nor could he explain the shadows he saw moving against the walls of his home, even when no one else was present. By the second week, the entire village had begun to resemble mourners at a funeral none of them could escape. A funeral for what? Some said for their sanity, others for their souls. Then came the march. It began quietly, almost imperceptibly. A single villager, Margaret Elwood, the baker's wife, was seen walking toward the church at dusk. She carried nothing, not even her shawl, though the cold gnawed at her. Her eyes were glassy, her lips moving in soundless prayer. Hours later, another followed, Thomas, the blacksmith's apprentice. Then two more. By the third evening, a line of nearly 20 villagers could be seen making the slow, deliberate trek toward the abandoned St. Bridget's. None of them spoke. None acknowledged calls from their loved ones. They walked with the precision of soldiers, eyes fixed forward, hands at their sides. When they reached the church doors, they did not enter. They stood there unmoving, as though waiting for something or someone to invite them inside. Families wept and pleaded. Husbands clutched their wives. Children clung to their mothers. But once a villager joined the march, they could not be turned back. Some who tried to restrain them claimed their loved one's body grew impossibly heavy, as though rooted to the earth itself. Others swore they felt an unseen hand pry their grip loose, forcing them to watch helplessly as their kin joined the procession. Evelyn documented these events with trembling fingers, her entries frantic, almost illegible. She described the marchers' faces as masks of serenity, like corpses who have forgotten they are dead. She noted that their numbers grew each night, yet no one ever returned. By the seventh night, nearly half of Hollowford stood in silent vigil before the church, eyes glazed, lips whispering prayers too faint to hear. Sheriff Alcott attempted intervention. He gathered what few able-bodied men remained and blocked the church steps, declaring that no one would pass. But when the marchers approached, something unseen swept over the sheriff and his men. Their torches extinguished, their knees buckled, and one by one, they collapsed into silence. When they rose moments later, their eyes too had glazed, and they joined the line. Despair spread like fire through the remaining villagers. Some barricaded themselves inside their homes, hammering planks across doors and windows. Others fled into the woods, though no one who left was ever seen again. The few who remained huddled together in prayer, though their voices cracked and faltered. For even prayer seemed unwelcome in Hollowford now. Evelyn found herself torn between terror and a perverse compulsion. Each night she watched the march from her attic window, her pen scratching furiously across the page. She could not stop herself. She felt she must bear witness, must record what others could not. Yet as she wrote, she realized her own lips were moving, whispering words she did not understand. Her notes described it plainly. "I write and I pray, though I know not what tongue I use." On the 9th night, she awoke to find her feet bare, her shawl missing. She was standing at her doorway, hand on the latch, ready to step outside. She did not remember rising from bed, nor crossing the room. She forced herself back inside, heart pounding, tears stinging her eyes. She scribbled a single note in her book before collapsing into a fitful sleep. It calls me too. Meanwhile, the church itself seemed to transform. Those who dared approach claimed the stone walls wept with moisture, as though the very building breathed. Candles burned in its windows, though none had entered to light them. Some swore they heard faint music within, an organ playing hymns long forgotten, chords echoing with dreadful harmony. On the 10th night, the entire village gathered, whether by will or by compulsion. Those who resisted found themselves herded along by unseen forces. Children screamed, elders wept, yet none could turn away. The marchers led the procession, their footsteps slow, deliberate, echoing like a drumbeat of inevitability. Evelyn stood among them, clutching her notebook to her chest. She tried to resist, to dig her heels into the dirt, but her body moved against her will. Her hand scribbled blindly. The ink smearing as tears fell onto the page. She recorded every detail: the glassy eyes, the vacant stares, the way the air thickened as they approached the church. She wrote until her fingers cramped, until the ink ran dry. When the procession reached the steps of St. Bridget's, the doors opened of their own accord. Inside, a darkness deeper than night itself awaited. It pulsed alive, like a heart beating in the void. The marchers stepped forward, one by one, vanishing into the blackness. Not a sound emerged from within, not footsteps, not cries, nothing. One by one, Hollowford was swallowed. Evelyn was among the last. She turned once, eyes wide with horror, and saw Sheriff Olcott, his face serene, guiding the final group forward. She looked down at her notebook and scrawled the last words she would ever write. The march is not ours alone. It waits for others, for you, for all. Then, with trembling hands, she stepped into the church. The doors closed behind her. The silence that followed was absolute. Hollowford stood empty. The sea was calm, unnaturally calm. No wave, no wind, no seagulls circling above. The silence stretched across the ocean like a suffocating shroud. For the survivors aboard the battered vessel, it was as though the very breath of the world had been stolen. The air smelled of iron and salt, heavy with the memory of blood. Father Dyer stood at the bow, his hands trembling over a weathered rosary. Each bead clicked softly, though his whispered prayers sounded broken, disjointed, less like petitions to God and more like bargains made in desperation. His eyes were hollow, fixed not on the horizon but on something far beyond it, as though he already knew where the end would come. Miriam, her hair tangled and face pale, clutched her journal against her chest. That journal had begun as a testimony, a record of events no one would believe. But now she understood it was something more. It was the last evidence of their existence, the last proof that they had fought, feared, prayed, and suffered. It was the ledger of their souls. Elias sat in the corner, staring at the deck. His once steady hands, so skilled in navigation, now shook violently. He muttered to himself, fragments of psalms twisted into something unrecognizable. His eyes had the glassy look of a man who had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. Above them, the clouds thickened into a blackened sky. The air turned colder, sharper, like the bite of unseen teeth. And then they heard it, a toll, one long hollow toll of a bell, distant, yet so near it vibrated in their bones. The sound rolled across the waters like thunder, though the sky remained unbroken. It was the same toll they had heard in their nightmares, the toll that had followed them across oceans, the toll of judgment. Father Dyer sank to his knees, clutching the rosary so tightly that blood dripped between his knuckles. "It is the last trumpet," he whispered. "The angels have sounded it. There will be no deliverance." "No," Miriam hissed, her voice trembling. "It's not an angel. It's them. It's the sea itself calling us." The ship groaned. The wooden planks bent and cracked as though unseen hands were prying them apart. Water began to seep up through the gaps, cold and black. The survivors scrambled to higher ground, but the ship was sinking faster than any natural wreck. It was being dragged down. Elias's muttering grew louder. It was written, it was always written. The sins of the fathers, the covenant broken. We are the sacrifice. Miriam slapped him, desperation sharpening her fear. "No, fight it. Don't let it take you." But Elias only laughed, a hollow, hysterical sound that made the others recoil. His laughter echoed the toll of the unseen bell, blending with it, as though his voice was no longer his own. The sea split, not in waves, but in a gaping wound. A vast trench opened beneath them, black and bottomless, glowing faintly with a light that was neither holy nor earthly. Shapes moved within it, vast formless shadows that shifted like smoke, yet felt alive. They rose and fell like titans, their presence pressing against the minds of the survivors until their thoughts began to unravel. Miriam dropped her journal, clutching her head. "It's inside me, it's in my mind." Father Dyer screamed scripture into the void, but the words twisted in the air, reshaping into an ancient tongue not meant for human mouths. His rosary snapped, beads scattering across the deck like drops of blood. The toll came again, louder, closer, final. The ship broke apart with a scream of wood and iron, plunging its survivors into the abyss. Darkness, endless, suffocating darkness. Miriam opened her eyes, or thought she did. She could no longer tell if her body still existed, but her consciousness drifted in a space where there was no sea, no sky, only a void filled with whispers. Faces formed and dissolved in the dark, faces of those who had gone before them. The lost sailors, the nameless dead, children, mothers, priests, killers, kings. Their mouths moved in silent chorus. Yet she understood every word. They were not gone. They were collected. Her heart froze. This was not death as she had been taught in Scripture. This was not heaven or hell. This was something older, something that fed upon humanity's faith and despair in equal measure. A voice boomed not from above or below, but from within. "You prayed for deliverance. Deliverance we grant, not to heaven, not to hell, but to us. You are ours, as all before you were ours." The faces pressed closer, their eyes hollow, their mouths stretching wide. Miriam tried to scream, but her voice was swallowed by the dark. Far away, on the empty ocean, silence returned. The wreckage of the ship floated briefly before being pulled under. Only the journal remained bobbing on the surface, its pages soaked but intact. It drifted across the waves, carried by unseen currents, until it reached a rocky shore. A fisherman found it at dawn. Curious, he opened it, reading the first words written in a trembling hand. "This is the record of our journey. If you are reading this, know that the sea does not forgive, and it does not forget. It takes not just the body, but the soul. Pray, but not too loudly, for it listens." The fisherman shuddered and closed the book. He thought of throwing it back into the sea, but something deep inside whispered against it. Instead, he carried it home. That night, as he slept, he dreamed of tolling bells, and the sea waited. Asterisk, some stories end with survival. Ours ends with silence. The journal you heard about was said to vanish not long after it was found, taken by hands unknown. Some believe it rests in a church archive, sealed away as forbidden scripture. Others whisper it was claimed by the sea again, swallowed before the truth spread too far. But the bell still tolls. Sailors claim to hear it on calm nights, echoing across black waters. Some dismiss it as superstition. Others know better. So the next time you stand near the ocean and you hear a sound that doesn't belong, pray it isn't the last prayer you ever say.